What's up, everybody? Welcome to part 3 of our video series where we are tackling the question of whether or not we can trust the Bible. If you haven't seen the previous video, make sure you do that so you can get caught up on where we're at. For this video, we're going to focus in on some objections of the Old Testament. The two biggest objections we see for the Old Testament is that the authors plagiarized from other religions and the lack of quality control for the oral traditions when it comes to passing down the scriptures. So we're going to take a look at each of those topics. First, let's look at the accusation that many of the greater stories of the Bible, like the creation story or the flood, were borrowed or plagiarized from other religions. The most common alleged source for this plagiarism is the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest pieces of literature we have. The Epic of Gilgamesh is thought to have been written around 2100 BC. This epic is often compared to the Bible because it covers similar stories like the creation of man, the Great Flood, and a few other similar stories. The Bible is often said to have borrowed from this source because while the Epic of Gilgamesh was written in 2100 BC, Moses didn't write the first 5 books of the Bible until 1440 BC. So you can see why people would have this view. If this one's written first, this is the original source. Since the Bible wasn't first, it's not the original. So first, let's address plagiarism. On paper, these claims make sense, but the issue is that the Old Testament wasn't preserved on paper until the Hebrew Exodus at around 1440 BC. In order to preserve these histories, the Hebrew people largely relied on oral traditions, so they shared the stories by speaking rather than writing them down. That may sound crazy to us in our day and age, but in their culture at that time, communicating literature via spoken word was seen as more reliable than written word. Their reasoning for this was that reading a book may lead someone to think that they've already mastered the material, but asking someone to repeat the material to you via spoken word would show whether or not they've actually mastered it. The next question that skeptics would ask is, are we really supposed to believe that the Hebrews memorized the first 5 books of the Old Testament? I'm glad you asked, skeptic. If you go back and read reports on the oral tradition, it is amazing the memories that people built at that time. There are reports of someone hearing a list of 2,000 names and then immediately repeating them in the proper order, or reciting up to 200 verses that had been given to them, but doing it in reverse. And there's reports of auctioneers listing all of the buyers they'd had throughout the day, and the bank would confirm it. But if you think about it, our minds still operate in this way too. John Walton, an Old Testament professor at Wheaton, uses the example of someone changing the lyrics to a song you know. Think about it, we rarely ever spend time reading the lyrics of songs that we're familiar with. But if our friends are singing that song and they swap out one word for another word that rhymes with it, we're immediately able to catch that switch. This points back to the reliability of the oral tradition. If we're able to recognize someone changing the lyrics to a song, how much more so would you be able to recognize the changes in the telling of a story that your entire people group holds as your history? Oral tradition is reliable because if you start changing the story, you're going to be held accountable by the people around you. So yes, even though we know that there are writings that are older than the Old Testament, the oral tradition of passing scripture down from generation to generation was there long before 2000 BC. Now, we can address the similarities in these stories. The main reason that the Epic of Gilgamesh is continually brought up is that the flood story is just too similar to ignore. In the book Evidence That Demands a Verdict, Josh and Sean McDowell were nice enough to draw up a little graph that shows the similarities. So you'll see that for the most part, they're basically the same story. Humanity is warmed to the flood, someone is instructed to build the ship is loaded with the animals and family, it rains, the flood destroys, the flood goes away, the ship ends up on a mountain, birds are sent to scout out the land, a sacrifice is made, and the hero is blessed. We'll come back to the similarities here, but I want to look at another account that the Bible is often accused of stealing from, and that is the Mesopotamian and Egyptian creation stories. The Mesopotamian story of creation, also referred to as the Enuma Elish, has a lot of similarities to the Bible. I'll show a list of them here so you can review. Just like the Epic of Gilgamesh, there's a lot of similarities. The Egyptian account of creation, even though it has a lot more variation and it's harder to compile, also has a lot of similarities to the biblical account. I'll list them for you here, and as you can see, this has even more parallels with the Bible. So how do we reconcile all of these similarities? Unfortunately, we have not come across a tablet yet that says, in 2200 BC, the Israelites claimed dibs on the flood and creation stories. So we have to look at the evidence and determine the most reasonable answer. First, it really shouldn't surprise us that there are similarities in ancient texts. If one of these stories is true, it's understandable that someone would borrow story elements here and there. So we acknowledge that these stories share similarities, but it's really important to see where they differ. With the Epic of Gilgamesh, the story differences start out right away with the reason for the flood happening in the first place. In this story, the gods wanted to flood the earth because humans got too loud and they couldn't sleep. So first, we have multiple gods, and second, these gods think nothing of humanity. They're just an annoying disturbance to be done away with. In the Bible, the flood is sent because of the wickedness of humanity. The immoral nature of earth prompts a moral response from God. There is no other flood story that shares that same reasoning. Next, we can compare Noah to the hero of the Epic of Gilgamesh. In the Bible, God saves Noah because he is righteous. In Gilgamesh, the hero saves himself because of his own bravery and wisdom. Or we can compare the ships used in the flood. In the Bible, we have very specific instructions for the ark, and it's built much like a modern ship. But in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the ship is basically a cube that wouldn't have really survived a fierce flood. Another difference can be found in the birds that were released after the flood. In Gilgamesh, the order of birds released was a dove, then a sparrow, and then a raven. But in the Bible, it's a raven and then a dove. Why does this matter? Thanks for asking again, skeptic. It matters because a raven can fly longer and survive on dead animals floating in the water. So it would make sense to first release a bird that could survive the flood if it was still there. You may see these differences as minor, but I think they help paint a picture of which literature should be looked at as authoritative. Now let's circle back to the creation stories. The Mesopotamian creation story is similar to the biblical account, but not so similar that I think we need to worry about it. It's the Egyptian account that poses more of an issue to the biblical creation story. There are some very similar characteristics when you compare it to the biblical account of creation. The order of creation is the same, the method of creation is the same. It really does look like one plagiarized the other. So how do we make sense of it? Well, there's actually a really cool explanation for the similarities between the Egyptian account and the Israelite account. And it has to do with the fact that the Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians for over 200 years. I mentioned earlier that the Egyptian account of creation has a lot of variations. So it would make sense that a culture that has multiple accounts of creation would borrow from one that has one consistent account of creation, especially if that culture was enslaved by the other for hundreds of years. The question we have to ask when comparing biblical accounts to those of other religions is which one is dependent on the other. Hopefully it's a little easier to see why we think the Old Testament is the source from which other religions are borrowing. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. I hope it was informative, and I hope you'll stick with me as we continue working through this question of whether or not we can trust the Bible. If you want to see new videos like this each and every week, click here to subscribe. And if you want to get caught up on my previous videos, click or tap right here. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you next week.